Hello, everyone, and very welcome to this Silicon Valley Innovation Center interview. I am your host, Rahim Rahimtula, and let me just apologize for the slightly late running of the program today. So I apologize for any inconvenience that may have caused. But I'm very glad that you're with us today because we're talking about intellectual property, and we are doing that with Alec Sorensen, who is the founder and CEO of Tradespace. And Tradespace, to put it briefly, is a platform for intellectual property analytics, I think it's safe to say. But I'm sure Alec will tell us more on that and many other issues. Alec, thank you so much for joining us today. And if I could, I think just to start out, I want to ask you a little bit about the context of Tradespace, in the context in which it came into being. My understanding is that from what you said in the past, that a company's value can to a large extent be determined by what IP it holds. In fact, like up to 60% of a company's value could be locked up in the IP. But the problem is that these companies don't always necessarily know what the value is of the intellectual property that they have, that they've been generating through their years of research and development. And so, as I understand it, Tradespace is kind of an answer to that problem, and it allows companies to see potentially what the value is of their intellectual property.
Yeah, exactly. So first of all, thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be on and to get to talk about a topic that, as you mentioned, is increasingly important to really any company in the economy, regardless of what market they're in. So to answer your question, I think it's important to first kind of understand where we've been and kind of how we've gotten to this point. So if you look back 10, 20 years at what makes a company valuable, the typical answer is their plant, their factory, their equipment, maybe their sales channels, their people, all of these physical assets. And that's how companies thought about what it meant to be a strong company. And fast forward 5, 10, 20 years where we've entered this knowledge economy in which the lifeblood of companies are the technologies they build, assets that aren't necessarily tangible. And as you said, they now account for up to 60% of the value of the company, more so than any other one asset class. And because this transaction or this transition has happened so quickly, companies haven't caught up. They don't have any systems in the way that they have, let's say, CRM systems to manage their sales or HR systems to manage their people. There's nothing to help them understand intellectual property. And so what we do at Tradespace as kind of the largest global IP marketplace is first to help companies understand what they have. And it sounds like a simple proposition, but large companies go through a number of acquisitions over their history. They develop new technology, and simply keeping track of what you have is a really difficult activity. And so we make that incredibly easy. And we use some pretty interesting analytics to help companies really understand not just kind of the assets they have, but what that means, what market areas they have exposure to, and how strong those technologies are. And I know we'll talk about this in a little bit, but we help them actually prioritize those technologies. So how do you look at 5,000 different technologies that a company like General Electric has developed over 20 years and make sense of it and figure out, well, what do we really want to think about? What's important to us as a company? What technologies could we group together to build something that's going to really add value?
Yeah, I mean, 5,000 is a really big number. And what I think is sort of remarkable is that these companies, they have all this intellectual property. They themselves do not know what that is. They don't necessarily have a good record of this. And so they could log into your platform, look at themselves, essentially, and like the records that you'll have there are actually better than what they have in-house.
Right, exactly. It really, again, speaks to this transition where you have an asset that's become incredibly valuable and that companies just don't really have exposure to. It's a major blind spot. And not just their own intellectual property, but what smart forward-leaning companies are realizing is that understanding what their competitors are doing, the technology investments that they've made as well, is now almost table stakes to being a competitive company in this economy.
Is having some IP, having this
having IP and knowing what your competitors have and knowing how what you have compares to that. Companies simply can't afford to not be strategic about this asset.
Interesting. And the other thing that I know you've talked about is that when you look at the IP activity, patent activity, I suppose, of a company, there's actually more than one way to read that. And actually, you can look at this as being a sign of the health of a company. And I suppose this is kind of what you were talking about, that in today's economy, the healthiest, strongest companies are going to be the ones with a lot of patents and a lot of activity in that sphere. Is that right?
Right, exactly. So we actually recently took a look at a number of different companies in a lot of different markets. And what we did was we looked at Forbes' most innovative companies and compared those to the Fortune 500. And what we found is that those companies on Forbes' most innovative lists, not only did they have higher valuations and higher multiples, but they were almost twice as IP intensive. So they had twice as many patents for every dollar of revenue than any other company in the economy. And that really just hammers home the point that not only are they developing intellectual property, they're being strategic in how they manage that and thinking about what areas do we develop IP and technology, and then what do we do with that technology when we have it. And we don't let it just sit on the shelf, but we actually develop an approach to get that technology into the market in the most effective way possible.
Indeed. And so, I mean, Tradespace can sort of help them do this. And so maybe let's talk about a little bit about how it does that. So, I mean, as I understand, Tradespace, sort of where it really adds a lot of value is that it rates patents, relative to other patents in a given space. And so I think this is where it starts to get really interesting, because that judgment that the platform is making is a qualitative one. And so it's potentially, it's contentious. People might want to know how you make that judgment. Where does it come from? So perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about how this rating system works.
Sure. So again, if you look at our mission and what the market needs, it's to find a better way for companies to share technology with each other, to get more value out of that. And so we address two problems. And so you talked about the first, which is scoring. How do you actually pick which assets are valuable, and how do you understand how valuable they are? And then the second is doing that connectivity. So bringing companies together and figuring out which companies are matched for that technology. So I can talk a little bit about our approach to both. So I came out of this space, after 7 years in consulting, working with companies that will go into a back room and kind of come out with a valuation judgment around a piece of IP. They will say, this patent is worth $1 million. And there's really not a whole lot of data behind that. And so when we approach this at Tradespace, our goal is not to provide an absolute judgment about a piece of IP. One of the coolest things about intellectual property, frankly, is that it could be worth very different amounts to different companies, depending on how they would use something. And there could be 5, 10, 20 uses for a given piece of intellectual property. So what we endeavor to do instead is to show users how valuable and how strong a piece of technology is relative to every other patent for that technology. And we're able to do that by looking at a number of data points in the patent themselves. So we look at the network of citations. So what that means is that every time somebody files a patent, they have to reference all the work that came before them that built up to this patent. And so we're actually able to understand where this particular piece of technology fits in its field of innovation. Is this something that a lot of other technologies are referencing? Are those technologies that are referencing, are they strong? Are they foundational? So we develop a really sophisticated sense for, again, how this compares to its peers. We look at other data points, things like how old is the patent? Is this still an innovative technology? Does this give you broad coverage? And we do a lot of other analysis that I won't go into here. But I think the point is, and I think this will be a theme kind of throughout, we do use some advanced methodologies. We use things like machine learning and AI. But the foundation of all of that is really an understanding of the market and the industry. So we spent months and months training our algorithms based on human inputs. So we worked with experts in a number of different technology fields to say, look, this is how we've ranked, these pieces of IP in a field. How would you do that? What would you change? And what are your considerations around that? And by doing that, we've been able to develop a set of algorithms and a logic that ends up being incredibly comprehensive across a number of different market segments. And it's always learning too, as we go out and continue to serve customers, as new transactions occur on the platform, as we get new data, we're continually learning and continually able to improve the way we help position pieces of intellectual property and contextualize them.
And so if I've understood correctly, so you have this algorithm, and you use machine learning to come up with a rating, and you're comparing that with human experts, with IP experts in the field, and they're looking at that rating that Tradespace has come up with, and they're saying, yes, I agree, maybe no, I don't. And if they don't, then you go back to your system and tweak it until you find why is it that your algorithm is not coming up with the human rating.
Right, exactly. And put technically, we've created a very robust proprietary set of training data that these algorithms can use. And what that comes down to is one of kind of a very unique way to understand the strength of a patent and then its marketability. So we're able to understand market trends as well to see, is this IP in a market that's expanding? Is it growing quickly? Is it shrinking? So we can tell companies, look, you have this technology, it's strong and it's growing. You need to prioritize this. Or maybe it's strong, but the market is weakening as we speak. And so it's not necessarily worth the effort. And so it's come together to very easily and quickly give somebody, an executive in a commercialization role, a simple, intuitive answer to how do I get more value out of my IP?
Sure. And the information you have about the market, if it's growing or shrinking, where does that come from?
So it's a combination of data. We look at new patenting behavior. And so this is something that I think we'll probably talk about. The money that companies spend on developing technology and ultimately on patenting that ends up being highly correlated with market performance about 18 months down the road. So the technologies that a company developing today are the same technologies they'll be getting revenue off of in 18 months, 24 months. So we look at that, we look at financial data, we look at acquisitions, new company formation, a whole set of data that gives us a comprehensive look at what this market is doing from a number of different perspectives.
Sure. And I wanted to, if we could just pause on this idea of artificial intelligence and machine learning for a moment, because it's a very hot topic today. And I just want to maybe first to say, do you think Tradespace, is it possible without machine learning, or is it because that we have these sophisticated systems now that you're able to make it work? Because there is so much data that you're pulling down. You're looking from patent offices all around the world, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely. So there's no doubt that what we're doing today wouldn't be possible without the infrastructure that exists. I heard a really interesting quote that to start a company in the 90s, a software company, it cost about $20 million to buy the infrastructure to develop the technology. And today you can do that for about $50,000. So just take a moment to think about kind of how far we've come. And so the ability for somebody to pull in that much data, to store it, to analyze it, you simply couldn't. It would be cost prohibitive to do that beforehand. But an important point as well is that I think you have to think about machine learning as being enabled by the application. And so, when we look at the market, and we actually work with a lot of companies that are looking to commercialize machine learning intellectual property. And what we see is that machine learning is becoming increasingly commoditized, which is good for the market as a whole. But without a strong understanding of the problem that you're solving, of the real value you can add to a company, then machine learning isn't necessarily valuable in and of itself. And to give you an example, we work with a lot of companies that have used other IP data solutions that will leverage intellectual property and they'll leverage big data and analytics. But they're not able to answer those core questions of how do I actually commercialize this technology? How do I find new technology to bring in? And so in order for these advanced techniques to be effective, they need to be paired with kind of a deep understanding of the customer problem and an ability to execute on that as well.
It's really interesting the way like your business is growing because of ML, and how other businesses who want to commercialize ML, are looking to you to help them do that. And so it's sort of,
Right.
from all sides, it's really, making things happen. And so I just want to ask, what do you think, if I can sort of digress slightly, about what are your thoughts, having worked with ML a lot and seen as well how it's developing in the market, and what are your thoughts about it generally in our economy, so to speak, and compared to using human experts who you also draw upon? I mean, do you see a bright future for machine learning and artificial intelligence in our workplaces? Do you think it's going to become more and more prevalent?
I do. Though I tend to think that it's perhaps a little bit more nascent than we tend to believe. The point at which AI can completely replace human workers to solve core challenges, I think is fairly far off, 5 to 7 years. I think what the near term and the midterm future look like are people being made more effective by the use of these tools. So to give you an example, when we come in to a university technology transfer office, for example, or to a technology scouting organization, our pitch is never that we're going to eliminate that function. In fact, we don't want to. We believe that there's parts of that role in terms of structuring deals and working with the inventors and reaching out to potential investors that, at least for now, inherently need to be done by somebody. And so what we want to do is we want to free up more of their time to do those critical value-added roles by eliminating some of the more kind of automatable commodity tasks. And we also want to make ourselves more effective as we provide services to companies, as we help connect companies with pieces of intellectual property. We're able to be much more effective. And one of our analysts can help 5 to 10 companies because we're using these powerful tools. So when I look at machine learning and AI, I think they're incredibly powerful. But going back to my previous statement, you need to have that problem, and you need to have an understanding of that problem. And for now, at least, I think that's going to be achieved by working directly with people to make their jobs more effective.
No, thank you, Alec. And do you ever find, it's interesting, do you ever find that the Tradespace algorithm comes up with ratings for intellectual property which you yourself could not have predicted or may not necessarily sort of understand, as it were, at first glance? I mean, like a piece of technology which you thought maybe wasn't that strong could come up with a very high rating, or vice versa. Does that ever happen?
Absolutely. And I think, again, this is one of the key value adds of machine learning and AI, is that when applied correctly, they do a great job of removing human bias. And so where I see this most for Tradespace is how we connect technology with companies. And like I said before, any technology could have 10 or 20 different applications. And so often we'll see, I'll approach something, a problem, with my own expectations about what a technology could be used for. To give you an example, we worked with a company that provided data compression, and they allowed you to edit that data in place. And so we were responsible for helping them exit that market. And we had our own assumptions about which industries this would be good for. Going into this, we reached out to folks in telecom. We thought about maybe some connected car applications. And it turns out where we saw a lot of strength was biometrics. Japanese biometric companies were investing significant amounts of money in collecting large pieces of data, and they needed to be able to change that data after they had stored it and transmit that data. And so you have an example of a market that was primed for this technology that I would have never gotten to, even knowing kind of the markets.
Sure.
But by looking at underlying technology, we got there quite quickly. And we were able to do that, and we provided other markets as well that wouldn't have necessarily been so obvious. So I think that's where the lack of bias becomes critical, is yes, in scoring and trying to cut through some of the hype around buzzwords, but also in making connections where the human brain might not necessarily go.
For sure. I mean, of course, that stands to have huge value for companies, because no one has complete vision. No one knows everything that's going on in Japan or in South America, or who knows
Right.
What markets companies are doing. So to be able to sort of have all that data and actually draw insights out of it, of course, is going to be a huge bonus. And so I wanted to ask you, just to move on, about, so once a company has their IP, on the database, has the ratings for it, then they think, okay, yes, let's commercialize this. Let's get some revenue out of this after we've invested so much in it over the years. And so you've talked a little bit about how you would help them find other markets, companies where that might be applicable. And now I'm wondering, what's the next step in that process? Like the transfer, if that's the right way to put it, of getting that technology from your company to the other company. And I wonder, how does that sort of happen? Are there models for how you should license technology, or how you should price it? That seems like a whole complex set of questions.
It is. And you're absolutely right in that one of the major reasons why deals fail once you've brought parties to the table is an inability to agree on a way to take that technology to market. And so one thing we do, and where we add considerable value, is to actually use data from the technology to help inform which approach we use to commercialize. So what we've seen is that there's a number of different ways to take a technology to market. You could spin it out into a startup. You could work with another company to co-develop it, to mature it a little bit more. You could simply license it out to a company that is buying up as much IP as they can to avoid legal risk. Or you could license out to a company that is looking to grow that technology and actually invest there. And each one of those models has different implications for pricing, for access, for terms. And what we see is that if you look at the market for technology, that tells you a lot about how you want to commercialize it. If something's in a very fast growing market, and maybe the technology is a little less mature, then spinning out a startup often ends up being the best way to de-risk that. And the best way to pair the risk with the opportunity. Whereas some companies may not want to license a technology that's still in its infancy, even if the market is growing. However, if the market's a little bit flatter and the technology is still new but interesting, then working with an entrenched competitor to co-develop that could be the right option. And you end up getting the best terms by structuring a deal like that. If you flip that on its head and you look at more developed technologies, maybe in mature markets or growing markets, then licensing becomes more effective and more viable. And by bringing technologies that are more mature, and our data is able to bear that out, we find that licensing deals happen more quickly. The general counsel's office raises fewer red flags. And so just taking a data-driven approach to how you choose to commercialize a piece of intellectual property ends up being a simple but really critical step. And so we'll bring in our own support staff, people who've negotiated hundreds of these deals to dot the I's and cross the T's. But ultimately, just coming in at the right order of magnitude and the right general consensus on how to do something makes all the difference.
Fantastic. Well, Alec, thank you so much. It's been wonderful talking to you. And I think the way it sounds like it's really interesting, and as you say, like increasingly strategic area that companies need to think about how they deal with their IP, how they manage it, and so on. And so just, I think as we draw to a close here, perhaps if you'd like to share with me any final thoughts for executives, companies out there who are thinking about their IP. I mean, maybe you've hinted at it already by taking a data-driven approach. I mean, is that ultimately where you would say that the priorities should lie?
I think even before taking a data-driven approach is the recognition across the enterprise that regardless of how much IP you have as an organization, your ability to navigate this landscape and think critically about your IP and that of your peers will be the make or break factor in companies' success and their ability to navigate this going forward and effectively generate technology and bring technology into the enterprise will dictate their success in the knowledge-based economy.
Thank you. Well, that's brilliant. I think it's very, I'm sure, sage advice for all the execs and the companies out there. And so I think on that note, we'll wrap things up. So Alec, just thanks very much for being with us today and sharing your insights.
Sure, it's been my pleasure. I'm glad we were able to talk.
And we hope that you, our audience out there, have enjoyed it as well. We would just like to say that if you want to find out more about everything we've been talking about today with Alec, as well as the more general theme of innovation and digital transformation, which is so prevalent today, then I do encourage you to check out our website, siliconvalley.center, and have a look at our executive immersion programs. They can really bring you right up to speed on what's happening today in digital transformation, and the intellectual property revolution, which is going on. And I would also just add that if you want to see the recording of my talk with Alec today, as well as our past expert talks, it's also available at our website at siliconvalley.center. And so on that note, I think that's where we'll wrap things up for today. So thank you very much for joining us once again. I've been Rahim Rahimtullah. My guest today is Alec Sorensen of Tradespace, and we'll see you again very soon, I think. Bye-bye for now.